All right, it is time to paint our nature scene. This image is inspired by northern Minnesota, Lake Itasca, the headwaters of the Mississippi River. However, it is just a lovely nature scene we're gonna paint together today. The first thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna get some painter's tape and use that to secure the edges of my paper so that when we add lots of water, the paper does not crinkle or ripple or bend. So any painter's tape will do. I use this Painter's Mate brand. I see that it peels off pretty easily. You'll notice on your paper that there is an edge where the ink of the drawing stops and the edge of the paper is. So that's where we're gonna try to match that line with our tape so that when we're done painting, our paint stays inside the inked lines. So we won't be perfect, but try to line up the tape with those lines as best you can. All right, 2 more sides to go. All right, I like to make sure that these edges are really touching. So either using a credit card or a gift card, or I'll use the back of my nail. I'm just gonna kind of push against the edge of that tape to really make sure the seal is tight. All right, now we are using watercolor paint today. I have my watercolor paint palette. I put all my tubes of paint out and then I let them dry. If you are working from a paint palette that the paint comes already dry, then you're set to go. If you have if you have tubes of paint, you can work with them wet, but you have to be careful not to use too much paint at a time or it becomes very, very saturated or very bright. And with watercolor, we want to layer from light to dark. So I've got my dry paint that I can add water to use. So what I'm gonna do first is I'm gonna take kind of a big-ish brush. I'm gonna use either like a round or a squarish brush. I think since we're doing our sky first, I'm gonna start with my kind of square brush here, and I'm gonna go ahead and just add a little bit of water to each of my colors so that when I get to that color, it's easy to wake it up. You can also use a little spray bottle or other sorts of things when you're waking up your paint. So we're gonna be starting with the sky. Now with watercolor, we can't cover up something that we do unless the color is darker. So we can't put light colors on top of dark colors. I'm gonna choose to paint a sunset for my sky. I love when there's different pretty colors in the sky. So a sunset has pretty colors. I know that this tree is kind of in the way of my sky, but my tree is going to be a brown, which is darker than the sky. So I know I can paint over my tree and come back later and make my tree darker. I will have a few leaves that I want to be green, and that'll be a little trickier to make the green show up on top of my sky. So I'm still gonna be kind of light or light-handed with the colors in my sky. To do our sunset today, I'm gonna start with yellow, orange, and then a red at the top, imagining that the blue night sky would be following that red. So yellow, orange, and red, mostly yellow and orange, because that's gonna keep my sky lighter so I can paint this tree on top of it. So I'm getting some yellow paint, waking it up by very gently wiping it with my paintbrush, and then I'm gonna put this yellow right along the top of these trees. It's okay if the paint goes on top of the trees a little bit, since those trees will have a green on them. That green can cover up the yellow because yellow is a very light color. So yellow is almost always a safe color to do first because you'll be able to cover it up later because it's such a light and not a very powerful ink of color. If you want, you can be kind of careful to avoid the tree trunk at least a little bit, but you don't have to avoid painting it completely. So I am constantly getting my paintbrush wet. So don't paint until your paintbrush runs out. Do a few paintbrush strokes, get a little more water, wipe it on the edge of the cup, get a little more paint, come back. It's a pretty repetitive process. Paint, water, wipe, paint, paint. So painting on the paper and using the paint in your paint palette. Now you'll notice I put the yellow all the way up to the sky because I can cover up the yellow with the orange paint that's coming next. So because yellow is a weaker color and it's easy to cover up, I want to make sure I have plenty of yellow so when I do add the orange, it doesn't take over. If you don't have any orange paint, if your paint palette is more limited, sometimes they skip orange and they go right to a red color. You can use something called a burnt umber. That's kind of an orangey color, or just use red, but in a very small amount. Mix that red with your yellow. Now, what I don't want to do is take a ton of water and splash it on top. Otherwise, that's going to create what's called blooms, where the water dries slower than the area around it, and it creates this funky edge. Instead, I want to make sure my brush is just wet enough to get paint on it, and I want to very evenly spread it and smooth it around. So I've got my orange paint now. Notice how I started at the top of my paper, because I want that orange to slowly fade into the yellow. So I start with my brightest where I want it to be the brightest, and then I let it mix because that yellow paint is still wet. So the orange should slowly fade into the yellow. So I'm gonna do this kind of quickly, because if your sky dries, these colors will not blend nearly as smoothly. This is called a wash, when we're using the entire area as wet and we're adding colors on top of it while it is wet. So we're doing wet on wet to create our sky. Another thing you might want to have on hand is a towel, something to wipe your brush off on. If it does get too wet, I just keep like a dirty little rag that I use for all my paintings handy so I can clean off my brush. If your painting starts to dry too quickly, what you can do is let it dry all the way and then get the whole thing wet again. But if you're going to re-wet it, let it completely dry so that some areas are not drying faster or slower than others. I think I'm happy with my sky. I've got mainly yellow and orange, and I did cover up some of my tree branches, but it'll be all right because these colors are so light. So I'm gonna go ahead and wash my brush, kind of wipe it off on the edge of my water cup, dry it a little bit, and figure out what's next. What I don't want to do is go paint my tree next, because when wet paint is next to wet paint, they mix. So if I paint my tree brown, it's going to mix with the sky, and the sky is going to start turning brown. So I have to wait for my sky to dry before I can paint the tree that is on top of it. If you want to speed up the drying process, I use a hair dryer. You can use a heat gun, anything that kind of just dries the paper faster. That's always an option. I'm gonna jump down and do the water because that's another big area. And these trees are touching the sky, so I'm gonna save the trees. Typically we work from furthest behind to closest. However, with watercolor, we have to do a little bit of jumping around to make sure that those colors don't mix. Now for my water, it's going to be mostly blue. However, I'm gonna wanna mix some green in it with it as well, because lakes are never perfectly clear and blue. So this time I'm gonna start to try to avoid my tree trunk more and more, because the colors I'm using are just gonna get a little darker, and I'm gonna want this lake to be fairly bright and saturated with color. So I'm gonna try to not go on top of other things. If that means you need to switch to a smaller brush, that is totally fine. If it goes on top of some of the rocks, that's okay. We're gonna have to go kind of in between them anyways to get all this flowing water. So you will have to go on top of those things. Something I didn't mention earlier that I hope you noticed just by watching is that I am moving my brush horizontally almost always. The sky has to be horizontal, the water has to be horizontal. If I start moving my brush up and down, it makes my painting feel flat because water does not flow down. It flows across. We look out across that lake. So I'm keeping my brush going side to side to make sure that that water is flowing side to side. Of course, there's exceptions when I get close to this tree, but then I like to go back on top of it and make a few horizontal lines to make sure that that illusion still works of the side to side. Now I've got some little bushy things over here that are kind of in the water. I'm covering them up a little bit with blue because I know I'll be able to see the blue through them, and later I can go back and add some more green on top. I'm gonna finish the blue on this side of the tree to make sure that I have all my colors consistently. I don't wanna finish one area of the water before I start the next, or when I'm done, those colors might turn out kind of different. So I wanna do my layers for all my color, all my water at the same time. So I'm adding that same blue. Of course, you'll now notice I'm going up and down because I'm being careful of that tree, but once I go up and down, I can now go on top of it and create those horizontal brush strokes, or I could turn my brush and go the other direction to make sure I have that horizontal effect. And now I'm seeing this is darker than this, so I might come back on this side. Watercolor does almost always dry lighter than when you put it on there. So keep that in mind, it will dry lighter. So if this is just drying faster, I don't want to be too picky and add too much saturation because it could just be drying faster, which is why it looks lighter than my other color. Now my water continues into the river down here, so I want to make sure I have a little bit of water down here as well. I can go pretty much right over the rocks at this point because there is so much little tiny spaces between them. I could avoid some of these big rocks, but I'm going to have to go over some of them to make sure that I really am consistent with all the water. So go right around them and next to them. And even though this is still part of the lake, I mean, it turns into a river, it might end up being a slightly different color just to show that it is more shallow. It might be more murky, so we will add those layers of colors when we get to these next steps. You'll also notice the direction of my brush is changing. Now my brush is going with the river. So you'll see some pen lines in your drawing that are kind of wiggling away to the corner of the paper. That's the direction you want your brush to go because this water is flowing in a certain direction, which is different from the lake water that is going side to side or staying flat. Okay. Here's one layer of water. I could leave it like this, however, it is very bright and saturated. To make it look a little more realistic, I'm gonna add some green or even some brown to it. So I'm gonna go get some green on my paint palette. And I think I'm gonna mix a new color. So I'm taking some green, moving it into an open space on my paint palette. And I'm gonna be desaturating my green. There's a few ways to do that. The very extreme exact way to desaturate or to make brown is to actually add the complementary color. In this case, the opposite of green is red. So I could add a tiny bit of red, which would tone down my green. However, that can happen pretty quickly. And I don't want it to get super desaturated. I just want it to be a little bit less bright. So instead of adding the complement, I'm going to just add an already neutral color, which is brown. So once I have a good amount of paint there, I'm gonna wash off my brush. I wanna make sure that I don't take green into my brown to make sure that stays separate. I'm gonna wake up some brown and I'm gonna add that brown to my green. Notice how the green instantly becomes less bright. This just makes it feel more natural. Now my water has probably already started to dry, so I'm not blending this the same way I did with my sky, but I'm gonna keep going horizontal. Look how instantly that water looks more like a lake. I'm gonna not add any more paint to my brush until I use this paint up because I want it to kind of mix with the blue that is there. In fact, it might be getting too green for my liking. We'll see by the end of it. I can always go and add more layers of blue if it's too green, but I'm gonna start with this green, moving horizontally side to side, following those edges. I can't forget this side of my lake because I want them to be the same color, the same mix of blues and greens. And then I've already run out of paint, so I'll either have to mix up some new paint or just carry over what's already on my brush to the river over here. So I'm moving kind of quickly because it's okay to be a little bit haphazard with these brush strokes. As long as they're going in the right direction, the looseness of your wrist can kind of help that realisticness happen. Now, this is kind of happening on accident, but I almost like, because my brush is almost clean, what's happening is it's actually lifting the paint off of the paper instead of adding more to it. And it's creating this light area in the middle where I keep brushing, even though there's no paint on my brush, and it's becoming lighter and lighter and lighter. This is something I'll do on purpose sometimes to make a lighter area or a reflection, but it can happen on accident and when we don't want it to either. I think I'm gonna roll with it because it looks like a reflection kind of the sky, the sunset. So if yours is doing the same thing where it's lifting off the paint, just roll with it. I like to say this phrase when I work with my elementary students specifically, but it applies in my own life as well: turn mistakes into masterpieces. So in this case, maybe this was a mistake. I didn't have enough paint on my brush, but I'm gonna declare it a masterpiece and I'm gonna roll with it. I'm gonna keep moving forward. I am somebody who learns by trial and error, and you are getting to watch me in the process. So hopefully that's encouraging that it's okay if you make a mistake, just roll with it, turn it into something else. All right, so I think I'm liking this color, maybe a little more blue. Look at yours and decide how much more of each color you want. Got a little bit of blue in my brush. I'm gonna spread that around, again, with those horizontal lines, paying attention to keeping paint on my brush if I don't wanna lift any more off of my paper. Even though your drawing is printed on watercolor paper, you can do too much water or work one area too much. If you're in one spot and you're brushing and brushing and brushing and brushing, you will notice the paper could start to tear or create little pills, not just like little balls of paper coming off. So if you notice that happening, just stop, let that area dry. When it's completely dry, you can literally just wipe off those pills of paper when it's completely dry, and then you can get it all wet and try again. But just be careful of that area, knowing that that part of the paper has kind of gotten a little bit weaker, and you don't want to make that happen again. Okay, I'm pleased. I've got my sunset, I've got my lake mucky water. I think I'm going to move on. I'm gonna work, I think, back at these trees now. However, I have to remember that they're touching my water. So I either have to wait for this to dry or blow dry it, because at this point, everything is touching my water. My water is everywhere. So I'm gonna go ahead and use my hairdryer to speed up the drying process. If you don't have one of those handy, get a cup of tea, get a drink, and then wait for it to dry. All right, I have sped up the drying process. My water is dry. I'm gonna go ahead and move to my trees in the background, these trees, and then I'll come forward and do the tree up here and the rocks. With the background trees, again, I'm going for green, but I don't want it to be a perfectly bright, saturated green. So I've got some light green. Maybe I'm gonna actually grab some of the dark green that I've got. Depends on your paint palette, what greens you have available. Further away trees should be less bright than ones that are closer to us. So I'm gonna make sure that my first colors that I use are less saturated. So I've got my greens. I'm gonna go ahead and get a little bit of brown. And here is my less saturated green. So I'm gonna start by just covering all my background trees with the same green, just making a overarching swath of green. Notice if any of your sky covered up the tips of your trees, to go ahead and cover that up. Your sky should be dry by now, so you can just kind of cover up those bits of yellow and make that whole area nice and green. We could even leave it just like that. That's beautiful, it's far away. We'll come back and add some shadows though later. I'm gonna move my green over to these trees and go and follow those edges. Now, because all the lines don't make an exact edge, you don't have to either. Find where it ends. It's okay to be loose and you could even create some new little tree tops. If your paint is going outside of the lines, that is totally fine, and cover this whole area in a nice wash of green. If you run out of green, just mix up some more. You'll be an expert at mixing some colors the more you do these kinds of things. The more you play with colors, the more understanding you'll have, and the more comfortable you'll feel knowing how to make sure your colors are the right saturation, how bright they should be, to make sure that they're the right value. Are they dark? Are they light? I'm using a lot of water because I want light layers of color. I can always make things darker, but I cannot make things lighter as easily in watercolor painting. So you always want to start with the lightest possible layer and go darker from there. So I've got my layers done. This is going to be kind of a dirt path sort of thing. I think I'll add some green, maybe this part at the front. You can always make some small changes as you are painting as well. Maybe you want your path to have grass on it as well. I can't actually tell if this was supposed to be grass or not in my original painting, so you get to decide. Now, since the water is dry, I'm gonna go and add just little bits of green. I'm just kind of pushing and pulling straight up. There's not a lot of paint in my brush, it's mostly dry, but just to kind of suggest those reeds. So hopefully that looks a little bit more green and you can see it without making it a super dark, obvious change. So I'm pleased with that. While I've got green in my paintbrush, I'm gonna come over and do this side of the green landscape as well. I find it convenient to try to paint all the areas that use the same color at the same time, less brush washing and everything else. And I already know how to make that color. I haven't forgotten my ratio yet because I haven't moved on to anything new. So I'm gonna go ahead and fill kind of around these edges, right up to the tree. Some of this is gonna be kind of a rocky color, so I'm actually not gonna cover up all of the edges there, but go kind of around it. And this even might be kind of sandy, but I think I'll just have a little bit of green here, and I can always go on top of it with some brown and sandy colors. So it gets me at least started. Okay, now I want to go back and add a little bit of shadow to this green area while I'm thinking about it. If it's still wet, great. If it's not the end of the world. But if it's still a little bit wet, we could get some nice blending that might happen just kind of by accident. That's the beauty of watercolor, is sometimes how it blends without you even really trying. This time I'm using a darker green and more brown to make my color darker. You could add some black, however, be careful. The black color gets really dark really fast. What I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna find some little shapes, or really just randomly place some tiny little blobs of this dark muddy green color just to create some definition. If you see, some trees look like they're behind others, so you could make the ones in the background the ones that have the shadow, but it's really kind of random and up to your discretion. It just creates a little bit more interest in that background area. Same thing here, I'm gonna kind of find maybe the side of a tree shape, and I'm gonna add some shadows to kind of one side, since these ones are a little bit more defined, to make it look like there is some shadow. Maybe some shadows right along the base of these trees. There is a sun setting, so there's not a ton of bright light, so there might be more shadows than typically, or at least maybe able to see the dark edges of things more easily. Brown really helps to darken while still staying warm. Black colors tend to have blue in them, which is helpful, it makes it rich and dark, but it might not be what we want on our kind of warm green trees. I'm gonna create some just dashes and dots and things to make it more interesting. Now I'll probably do some other things over here, but I'm just gonna go ahead and make a few little bunches of this dark. Since I'm using a pointy-ish brush, I can just use the tip and go straight up and down to make some little like bushels of bushiness and add some texture to that grass. So there's no exact way necessarily to just add some interest with some darker areas. And I think I'll add some more browns on top of that. All right, we are getting really close. So I'm washing my brush. I think it's time to move on to our browns. So I think our tree, our rocks, this path, that's kind of the last few things with our browns. You might have just a regular old brown, you might have a burnt sienna or a burnt umber. A few of those colors can be fun to mix together. So here's kind of my more burnt umbery color. The sienna is more, I think this one, yeah, is more orange brown. So that's a fun one to use as well. I could even use both of them together. If I want my brown to get darker, this is when I'm gonna mix with some black to make that brown even more dark. I want my tree to be the darkest brown. I think most of my rocks and path are gonna be more of a lighter brown. So knowing that this one's gonna get darker, I think I'm gonna do it first to get my first layer done. I've kind of mixed some regular brown with a little bit of the sienna to keep it warm, but mostly just a regular brown. Now, it might be helpful to switch to a smaller brush for these details, especially these little twigs. If you don't have a smaller brush, that's okay. You just use whatever you've got on hand. Just a steady hand, if you've got one, is helpful. Even if you taped your art down, what you can do is actually pull from the tape and lift the whole art and turn it. Or it can be helpful to tape your art to a clipboard so that you can turn your art, because sometimes it's harder to turn your wrist and it'd be easier to actually turn the whole piece of art, especially if you're at a table. So it's probably a little late since I, had you tape your art down earlier, but just some tips for the future, or if you want to stop and move your art now, that is totally up to you. I'm gonna go ahead and just get all these little branches, have little bits of brown. When they are super tiny branches, I don't really have to worry about the brown because the black pen line is kind of like the dark color. And so we're just filling in where there are actual shapes, where the branch has space in between its branches and in the lines that I drew. So I'm trying to fill in those areas and leaving the rest kind of the way they are if I want to. If I get outside the lines, it's no big deal. When I go and add my leaves, I could cover up some of my mistakes with the leaves, but I'm gonna do that once this dries. So there's my first layer of the tree bark. Now I think I'm gonna go and add some basic layers to my rocks. I'm gonna make this color much, much lighter. To do that, I'm adding a lot of water because I want to add shadows to my rocks later. I don't want them to all be dark. So I want to start with the lightest, most value. And this I'm more careful trying not to get this onto the water, but only on the rocks themselves. So again, a smaller brush could be helpful. You'll notice where you got blue paint on your rocks that they look darker with the brown on top of them. That's okay. Maybe they're a darker rock. That's kind of something we can just work with. Maybe they got splashed with some waves or water, so it's okay if they are not perfectly brown, if they're more blue-brown. Or if you remember, we can actually add the complementary color to blue to make it turn more brown, which in this case is orange. So orange is the opposite of blue. So if one of your rocks is super blue and it is not turning brown like you want, then all you have to do is get a little bit of orange and paint that orange right on top of the blue, and it should mix a little bit and make orange. Thankfully, browns are typically kind of a more orangey color, so hopefully it already makes your rock look a little bit more brown, and again, just makes it look kind of darker, which is fine because we're gonna add those shadows coming up next anyways. So I've gone on top of all those. I mentioned earlier that I might turn some of this area into sandy rocks. So I'm using more of a yellow to go on these, knowing that I kind of want them to be a little sandy. In fact, I might actually put that yellow just over my water a little bit. I think that looks really nice right there. Just a tiny bit of yellow on top of that water, and it makes it look a little bit shallower. Like you can see through the lake water and see that shallower bed of sand. Okay, I've got some on my brush. I'm gonna use that kind of yellowy color for my path over here. Perfect. Okay. Now the final, oh, I forgot some rocks. Don't forget these tiny little rocks over on this end of the river. Just do a gentle kind of wash of color of browns over them. All right, and now we're up for the final steps, our shadows on our rocks. I'm gonna finally actually switch to a smaller brush. I've been doing all of it with this brush and my big kind of squarish brush, but I'm gonna switch to this guy so that I can get these shadows right. So I'm gonna mix up a little bit more brown. And maybe some black. Okay, still fairly watery because again, I always want to do layers. I don't want to just attack it and make it all dark. Now I gotta look for the sides of the rocks, like this big rock. He has a side that's towards us. So I'm gonna make that side dark. This one has kind of this side facing us and this side. So we're not painting everything. We're just kind of looking for sides. If there aren't sides, pick a side. Here's a totally round rock. Look over here, it's kind of the bottom left. So maybe I'll do kind of the bottom left. Now that rock has a side. Maybe over here, this one kind of has a side. I'm gonna fill that in, maybe it's got a little crack. This one, maybe bottom left, maybe the bottom. I'm kind of trying to be fairly consistent without making it a pattern, so still should look fairly random. Now this one already has a dark area because of the water, so what I could do is I could just use that to my advantage and I could just make that the shadow. On some of these little rocks, all I'm doing is making a little dot dash on kind of part of it just to suggest the idea that there is a shadow. We don't have to be exact, maybe do a few little lines like there's some cracks. On this guy over here, we're gonna make him kind of have one side by just deciding wherever the shadow ends, that's where the side ends. I think this is a rock over here, we're gonna give it a little shadow. So again, just kind of picking a direction, an edge, and making that the shadow. On these rocks, same thing, I'm just gonna find a spot kind of quickly. I'm not being super exact about it, making some shadows. Looking good. Now I'm gonna do a fun little trick to make some reflections in the water. I'm gonna mostly wash my brush, but it has a tiny bit of brown on it. Underneath the rocks, I'm just gonna do some little horizontal squiggles. Tiny bit of paint, some little horizontal squiggles. This is making a reflection in the water of the rocks. A little bit of paint, little horizontal stroke. Not a lot, it should be very slight. This should work to your advantage if you had any mistakes and your paint got outside of the water a little, or outside of the lines a little bit. Over here, I'm doing the same thing, little strokes of paint. Okay, so I've got a little bit of shadows. Don't overdo it. You can kind of see my pen lines where I drew the shadow for you. If you just follow that little squiggle with the direction of your brush, that should show that shadow nicely. All right, my last thing to shadow is the tree, and then I've got those leaves. So still using my small brush, I'm gonna again make a darker brown. And I'm gonna pick a side. In this case, I think I'm gonna do the left side because I've got more texture that has been drawn and that I drew on that side. So I'm gonna go right along that side with my brush. And while my brush is wet, so I'm working kind of quickly, I can just fade it off to the other side. You can kind of hear the scratchiness of my brush because it's a little dry, but that's good because it creates kind of some of that texture of the tree bark. So I'm kind of using up all the wet paint, and then once I feel that my brush starts to dry, I'm just kind of keeping those vertical strokes, and I'm just fading that shadow over to the right with my vertical brush strokes. As for the tree branches, I can add a little bit of a shadow kind of along the bottom of the tree branch. Not really trying to be super exact, but just creating a little more variation in the color values. I forgot a branch, so I'm making that brown. Okay, I'm gonna wash off my brush and we're gonna do some leaves. Last but not least. Now, depending on how bright your sky is, your green might need to be fairly thick. So try to use a little less water and make your paint a little bit more thick and painterly so that it can actually cover up some of the sky. I'm still not gonna have the paint too saturated. I'm gonna have a tiny bit of brown with it to make sure it's not unrealistic. And then I'm just gonna find those little squiggles and make some of my own little squiggles. So I'm not trying to be exact. I'm not getting inside the shape line by line. I'm just using those pen lines as a guide for where to put my bunches of green, my little leaves. And if you go outside the line, that's good because it makes it look like there's another leaf growing there that we just can't quite see. So mix up some more green if you run out. Keeping it, again, kind of thick so you can see it on top of those, on top of the sky, on top of the branches. If your tree is feeling too sparse, you can go ahead and add some more leaves too. I know this tree is, I don't know why it doesn't have its leaves, I should find out, but it's kind of what that tree looks like at the spot that I was referencing. So maybe there's a few leaves over here as well. And I think that about does it. I hope that those directions were helpful and that you learned some fun techniques. I hope you made mistakes because I hope you turn them into masterpieces. Now, when we're done, we get the joy of taking off the tape. So I'm gonna make sure my brush is washed so that I take good care of my supplies. I'm gonna find my tape and I'm going to pull away from my art. So I've pushed my tape down. It's not pulling up, it's pulling away from my art. It does tear the paper a little bit, so be careful, don't go too fast. And I'm gonna kind of bunch it up as I go. And you have successfully completed a watercolor painting. If you had fun doing this, I hope that you check out my other watercoloring pages available. Tell a friend, you could get a whole painting party together. Put this video up on your TV, have a bunch of friends over, watch along. It's so much fun to do with other people. I hope you are encouraged that you can make art at any age, at any skill level, and I hope to see you again. Thanks for painting.